is being given by Mrs. Pan McCaslin, and she's going to present to us a story life of the Reverend Peggy Bosmeyer Campbell. Pan McCaslin is a psychiatric nurse and mental health therapist who spends both her professional life and volunteer time helping making a difference for those in need. Pan has served on Credo team.
Sister. When Joanne contacted me and asked me if I would present on Peggy Bosmeyer Campbell's life, I said yes, and then I got off the telephone and thought, okay, now how do I know Peggy? Well, I know she was my daughter's spiritual director. I know she married my daughter and son-in-law, and that she baptized my first grandbaby. So that's how I know her personally. Professionally, I knew her in the church in the Diocese of Arkansas, where I lived for 35 years. So in order to gather information, I've interviewed family members, friends, staff members, lay leaders, deacons, priests, and bishops. I've read news articles, church histories, gathered articles from the archives of the Episcopal Church, the chapter from Mary Donovan's book, Women Priests in the Episcopal Church. I've watched video clips that were made for the honoring of Peggy at the dedication of the Christian Ed building at St. Margaret's Episcopal Church in Little Rock, which is the congregation she was serving at the time of her death. So Peggy Bosmeyer Campbell was the first woman ordained south of the Mason-Dixon line, but she was so much more. Bishop Greg Rickel wrote on his blog on December 13th of 2008, the day of Peggy's death. She was a force to be reckoned with and one of the most caring forces you would ever know. Retired Bishop Neil Alexander, in his homily at Peggy's funeral, shared, Peggy could be deadly serious, delightfully playful, stunningly clear, richly ambiguous, brilliantly analytical, wryly humorous, profoundly spiritual, tenderly motherly, pastorally gentle, and flat out silly. But always, always, she always knew who she was and that she belonged to Jesus. She was a wife, mother, sister, daughter, and friend to so many. As people shared stories with me, there were tears and a longing for connection, as well as a joy to be telling Peggy stories. Peggy was born July 26, 1948 in Helena, Arkansas, which is a delta town right on the Mississippi in Arkansas. She was the daughter of Thomas Bosmeyer, who was an insurance adjuster, and Margaret Marklin Markey, as we knew her, Bosmeyer, an elementary school teacher. And Peggy had an older sister named Judy. Being raised in the South, family, education, and religion were valued above all else. And always, always, everyone had a place at the table. In addition, there were Southern rules about how to behave as a Southern woman. Peggy attended St. John's Church in Helena. And St. John's has an important history because it claimed both Henry Richter, who was professor of pastoral theology later at Virginia Theological Seminary, who was in favor of the women's ordination. And St. John's also raised up presiding Bishop John Maury Allen, who opposed women's ordination. At 12, sitting in a pew in St. John's, Peggy, in response to some deep questioning about life, God, and life circumstances, had a life-changing, deep experience of God and God's unconditional love for her. An experience which grounded her in times of turmoil and allowed her to speak of her convictions even when, as a teenager, she spoke of becoming a priest. She was told to become a nun. Peggy's father, Thomas, died of cancer when Peggy was 15, which turned out to be a significant event in her life. She graduated from Helena High and traveled north to Fayetteville to the University of Arkansas. There in Fayetteville, she was a member of Pi Beta Phi sorority, got several, and her degrees were in educational philosophy. At the time, David Johnson, who went on to become Bishop of Massachusetts, was the chaplain at the university, the Episcopal chaplain at the University of Arkansas. And he spent many hours with Peggy in discussions about questions she had about life, about God, and about her future. And David was the one who encouraged her to go to seminary in Christian formation, which she felt called to. But in order to go to seminary, she had to have Bishop Keller's permission, which she was able to get. And in 1971, entered Virginia Theological Seminary and was one of 2 women in her class. The other one was on the Masters of Divinity track. And Peggy was going for a master's in theological education. Mary Donovan, in her book, wrote, Peggy entered Virginia Theological Seminary as a Southern belle, submissive, demure, pious, carefully distinguishing herself from the few women there who were on the MDiv track. One of her friends, Pat Merchant, described that when Peggy came to seminary her first year, she had, and remember, this was the early 70s, and so hair was teased in the big bouffant with the bow in the back. But the summer after her first year in seminary, she took clinical pastoral education at Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston, which was difficult for her. She was a Southerner in a northern area. Mary, in her book, quoting Peggy, said, "It was a painful growing up experience for me. For the first time in my life, there was a demand for me to be the person I knew I was, to give up the survival game I was playing. I came back knowing I wanted to work for the church full time, but I was still vehemently against my being ordained. Not against women's ordination, just the ordination of this woman." Peggy graduated from Virginia in 1974. And in 1999, she completed her Doctor of Divinity, which she had taken over several summers and while she was on the teaching faculty at Sewanee. We'll come back to that. So there was an ongoing discussion about women's ordination that was continuing in the church in the 70s. By Peggy's second year at seminary, she'd been approved as a postulant and transferred to the Master of Divinity tract. But this was not without ongoing discussions with Bishop Keller, the then Bishop of Arkansas, who was reported to share to Peggy, "You are the embodiment of someone who has had a call." After the 1973 General Convention in Louisville, Kentucky, Peggy, in her senior year, wrote this poem on her return. "I come to you hurt, discouraged, questioning, and bewildered. I ask only to serve our Father as a vessel, a vehicle of his reconciling love and his commanding call to responsibility. I have asked only to accept this responsibility that you yourselves have taught me I must do. You have told me of a God who has no limits, yet now you limit him. You have revealed to me a God who fathers us and loves us fully, a God who reveals himself in our relationships with others. Yet now I hear from you that the revelation can only come through men. You have taught me to worship a God who suffered himself to come to us through the vehicle of women. Yet now you tell me that woman cannot be a vehicle of God's grace. You have taught me well. Thus I must reject what you seek to teach me now. But if you tell me that it is only that you are frightened of these changes, then I come to you with hand outstretched and open heart. I too am afraid of what our Lord calls us to now. I too am lost and bewildered when over and over again I am called to leave old wineskins behind and in faith take hold of new ones. But because you have taught me well, I know to fail to do so means death. And so in fear and confidence, I stand where he stands. I walk where he says we must walk. And I long that you, who showed him to me, might one day walk there too. The Reverend Dr. Chris Keller, retired dean of Trinity Cathedral in Little Rock, interviewed Peggy during his studies at General Seminary. And I have a video clip.
Her ordination. I don't remember when I first met Peggy. I mean, she's a little bit older than I, and when she was ordained, I was in college, and so I wasn't at the service. And so, I mean, I knew that the kind of the women's ordination controversy was being played out in Arkansas, and that there was a famous debate between Peggy and Bishop Terwilliger at the cathedral. And Peggy was, just a seminarian, I think, or maybe a recent seminary graduate, and was debating Bishop Terwilliger. And that's kind of legendary, but I was in college in Massachusetts, and so I didn't see any of that. So I heard only about all of that much later. I think that one of the things that I found, so the paper that I did was on the Philadelphia ordinations, and I was basically just doing a research on kind of how all that unfolded. And just as part of that, I thought, well, it'd be interesting to talk to the two women that I knew that might have been ordained as part of the Philadelphia ordinations. And my understanding had been they had chosen not to. And I wanted to see if that was in fact the case, and so kind of how they looked at it at the time. And one of them was Peggy and the other was Alice Mann. And as it turns out, there were about 30 women who had finished seminary or were about to finish seminary, who were invited to participate in the Philadelphia ordinations, in addition to the 11 that did. And Peggy and Alice were two of those. And what Peggy was really interesting in talking about how she sized all that up as it happened. She went to the Louisville convention in 1973, I guess.
Right.
It was where women's ordination was kind of on the ballot, and it was going to be close. And as it turned out, it was close, very, very close, and it didn't pass. And I don't remember exactly how the vote played out. Right. And Peggy said that it was at that convention, she was just an observer at the convention, and that it was there that she didn't become, it wasn't then that she became convinced that she had a vocation in the priesthood, but that it was there that she became convinced that that women's ordination was a moral imperative for the Episcopal Church. And she said, and what convinced her of that was a group of arguments she was hearing from the floor of the convention opposing women's ordination. And I'm just going to quote you what she said about that. Right. She said, "I was hearing things in Louisville in the name of opposition to women's ordination that I had never heard in all my life in church. People were saying that it was Jesus's maleness that counted instead of his humanity. It was as though the church, to defend an all-male priesthood, was being forced to say something new and different, that the maleness of Christ was an issue rather than his humanity. The sense that a church which denied the ordination of women on such grounds would be a different church with a different gospel than she had known and believed led her to conclude that there was, I quote, a gospel imperative to be for women's ordination. And it was this for her before ordination became a personal conviction. And so not that long after that, she was invited to participate in the Philadelphia ordinations, and she immediately said no. I would describe her attitude about the ordinations, the Philadelphia ordinations, as ambivalent. It was very clear to her that she should say no to participating, and she gave two reasons. One was that she said it would abort, that was her word that she used. It was abort what we had already started in Arkansas, which was laying the groundwork for the acceptance of women's ordination. It would have poisoned her relationship, she said, with her bishop and with people in the diocese that were kind of warming up to women's ordination. And she said also she couldn't square the fact that in the ordination service she would be professing loyalty to the doctrine, discipline, and worship of the Episcopal Church, and she would obey her bishop. And yet, in participating in the ordination, she would not be in keeping with the doctrine, discipline, and worship of the Episcopal Church. So she said she just couldn't square it. But so that's on the one hand. But on the other hand, she said, number one, she was friendly with all of the women that participated in the Philadelphia ordinations, and she was good friends with some of them. And she said she was new and fresh to all of this, and emotionally kind of wasn't carrying a lot of baggage about it because she was young. Right. And she said some of these women had been kind of, had been a battering ram on the Episcopal Church on this issue. That's my word, not hers, for a long time. Right. And they were worn out and mad. Right. And she says, honestly, if I'd gone through what they'd gone through, I don't know how I might have calculated the rights and wrongs of it. She said there are prophets. The church needs prophets and it needs priests. She says they played the prophetic role, and that probably helped prepare the church come more quickly to acceptance of women ordinations. She says, and I was never called to be a prophet. I was called to be a priest, she said. Yeah. And
that's important. Thank you, Chris. So General Convention of the Episcopal Church did approve the ordination of women as deacons prior to 1976. And so after graduation, Peggy was an ordained deacon and assigned to Grace Episcopal Church in Pine Bluff, and then St. Mark's Episcopal Church in Little Rock. Finally, in 1976, General Convention approved the ordination of women as priests and as bishops. Peggy was there for that vote and sitting with the Reverend Dr. Stuart Hogue in the gallery. And what Stuart shared was she wept and she wept and she wept. It was important for Peggy to be ordained in the Diocese of Arkansas, but she had no need to be the first one ordained right after January 1st, which was the first available day. And she and Bishop Keller worked together to plan her ordination for January 29th of that year of 77. Several things were needed in order for Peggy to be ordained. One, there needed to be a congregation willing to have her at the altar. And the other was that Bishop Keller needed no one to object at the ordination service. And both of those came about. As far as no one objecting at the ordination service, even though Bishop Keller, it's reported, took quite a pause, those who might have chosen to object chose to not attend the ordination service. And St. Michael's in West Little Rock agreed and welcomed Peggy as their first female vicar. There was discussion prior to that, and the members of the church polled, as far as their willingness to have a woman priest. One person was quoted as saying, "I've never had a woman priest. I'm willing to give it a try." And it was reported that no one objected or left the church over Peggy coming. So in her early ministry, Peggy served as part-time vicar at St. Michael's and then was on diocesan staff as program director in charge of the church camp at Camp Mitchell up on Pettigene Mountain. So she started off as a very, very part-time vicar, and through her 17 years, moved into full-time status. Well, shortly after her ordination, Peggy began to get invitations for symposia, educational events. She was a novelty, but she also was criticized and scrutinized. The Reverend Dr. Stuart Hoke, who had served as her curacy mentor and friend, reported there were situations in which she was vilified, interrogated. Some rose up and infantilized her. They tore her apart. Here she was, a young priest, but she exhibited more courage than two or three together. Even though she was scared, she showed up. She stayed away from the theology of ordination, but she spoke to her call, her right to celebrate the Eucharist, to be a priest. Hope continued, just the courage it took was amazing, but the cost was great. It made her sick at heart at times. In her early ministry, she met and married Dennis Campbell, and they had 4 children. St. Michael's, where she served, met in a former pool hall. Then as it grew, it bought an old plumbing store across the street and then spread out in various other businesses along Durwood. St. Michael's began to be known as the Episcopal Church over there on Durwood. Peggy served St. Michael's for 17 years. And then after facilitating a land purchase, building a church, and preparations for the move to a new church space on Cantrell on Pentecost Sunday of 1994, she preached her last sermon. And she and Dennis and the kids went off on an adventure to Swanee, where she was hired to teach contextual education at the School of Theology at the University of the South. And then finally, in 2001, she returned to Little Rock to become the canon missioner and vicar of St. Margaret's Episcopal Church in West Little Rock, where she remained until her death in 2008 from pancreatic cancer. Throughout Peggy's life, she was discerning. She discerned her vocation, her next steps in her marriage and her family, her education, her ministry, new programs, and her legacy. She was clear on many things, as you heard from Chris Keller. Peggy always knew she was called to be a parish priest. She was never hung up on titles. When she was once interviewed by someone who was very critical of women priests, they asked her if she wanted to be called the High Priestess or the Holy Mother. And Peggy is said to have quietly answered, "You may call me Peggy." And to many, she was Peggy, but she was Mother Peggy to others, a Pisco Mama, Mama Bear, my mom. And although Peggy knew her calling was to parish ministry in the early 90s, she recognized a call to something different. Our own Joanne Barker is credited with encouraging Peggy to apply for the contextual education position that had opened at the School of Theology at Swanee. After prayer and discussion, Peggy accepted the position and moved with Dennis, her husband, who is also a priest, and the kids to live in Swanee for 7 years. During her parish ministry, Peggy often used the image of dropping a pebble in the water and watching the ripples. How one's ministry is like that, making a difference for one group, one person, and the effect moving out into the community. When asked by distraught parishioners and friends why she was leaving Little Rock and St. Michael's, Peggy responded, "If I go to Swanee, I will be a pebble. My ripples will go further. We'll make a difference for the church." During Peggy's 7 years at Swanee, she directed the contextual ed program and the continuing education program, co-directed the Church Development Institute, and taught classes in congregational development and Christian ed, along with serving as a co-vicar with Dennis, her husband, at a teaching mission in Swanee. And oh, by the way, raising 4 school-age children. Neil Alexander shared that Peggy's pedagogical style was about modeling. She was not always happy where the church was, but she had a way of articulating it in ways that people could find useful. He stated she was gifted at and sensitive to figure out how to push the envelope, explore new ways, while at the same time keeping a firm grip on the church's traditions. She wanted to stretch, innovate, and think in new ways to look through different lenses with a completely firm grip on tradition, and had a deep appreciation for our inheritance. Her teaching, her modeling came from a clear knowing of her relationship with Jesus that never wavered, even though life at times was chaotic and challenging. When Peggy returned to St. Margaret's as vicar in 2001, she remained committed to theological education for all and reached out to the Reverend Dr. Chris Keller to invite him on his return to Arkansas to help create a center for theological study based at St. Margaret's. Spiritus Incorporated is the nonprofit formed as an umbrella for Christian formation and study that now serves adults and youth of all faith. Its impact is ongoing. The first part was the Institute for Theological Study at St. Margaret's. Out of that grew the Interfaith Center, which now offers programs for adults and youth camps. Another part of that was the development of SUMA, a longtime vision of Reverend Keller's for student theological debate, helping high school students express their faith and concerning issues in the world. Today, SUMA is under the direction of the Beacon Center at Swanee, but began out of the Institute. Peggy had a commitment to education as part of her legacy. But let's spend the rest of our time talking about how Peggy touched the lives of so many. First, she was a visionary, and she invited anyone along who wanted to be part of spreading the gospel to any and all. Staff members and volunteers shared stories of approaching Peggy with an idea and feeling empowered to explore and discern it themselves in the community of others and find ways to make the table wider and longer. When things would get difficult, she would remind folks, community is difficult. Jesus is the center of everything. Your gifts are meant to reach others. Ministry can be messy. Answering a call by God affects your family life, your friendships, your every breath in ways you never expected. Peggy's door was always open. She would invite you in, listen to what was bothering you, and as Jesus would say to the person, "What would you have me do?" She would invite you to say your prayers, to laugh, to be silly, to play with friends, and always, always to play with babies. She loved babies. And she lived in a household with another priest and 4 children. And on Sundays, according to Dennis, her husband, the only way for both of them to get to 2 different churches for 2 different services with 4 children was to invite a sitter into the house at 5:30 in the morning as they both dashed out the door. The kids were gotten up, fed, and gotten to church. Peggy's touched the lives of so many. And in our church and the world today, we have young adults in their 30s and 40s and 50s who are active in leadership positions throughout the church, who are priests in other dioceses, who share the light of Christ that was kindled in them by being ministered by Peggy or those to whom she ministered. One former youth director of Peggy's wrote about fingerprints that Peggy left everywhere, and that youth and young adults who need to envision the church in the world, who need to envision the church leaving the building, were touched by Peggy. In the writings and interviews, people would speak in awe of the aura around Peggy when she celebrated at the altar. Peggy considered everything at the altar sacred. Those who served with her, the prayers, the sacraments. At the same time, when toddlers got loose from their parents and wandered up to the altar, she would scoop them up, put them on one hip, and continue celebrating. She considered each and every person sacred. But Peggy was not just a priest. She was first and foremost a mom and a wife. Her daughter, Lorne, shared, there might be lots of people around, but if one of us had an issue, Mom was on it. Many talked about the open door policy at the Campbell house, whether in Little Rock or in Swanee. The front porch was often an impromptu counseling spot for Peggy or Dennis with youth who needed attention. Even though diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, Peggy continued to empower, to encourage, and to reach out to those in need. In the latter part of her illness, friends were at the house, singing songs, laughing, telling stories, sharing Peggy's legacy even as she lived. The weekend of her death, Vocari, which is the college weekend event similar to Happening, was occurring at Camp Mitchell. When word came that Peggy had died, many of the young adults wanted to go help support Dennis and the kids. They were reminded by the adults on staff that many of them were there on their spiritual journeys because of Peggy, and she would remind them that they too were pebbles. On the day Peggy died, she was surrounded by friends and family members. On the TV was the Campbell family favorite movie they watched every year. It's a Wonderful Life. Peggy believed that. I've only presented a few of many stories I've heard over the last 6 weeks. Peggy was not a saint, and she would be the first one to assure you of that. But she did have a serenity and a peace that people yearned for. One young adult was able to articulate, Peggy helped us belong. We belonged in worship. We belonged to others. But most importantly, to know that at any time, anywhere, we always belonged to God. One of Peggy's regrets was that although raised out of St. John's Helena, she was never invited to celebrate the Eucharist. She was invited to preach at St. John's, but never celebrate. The picture on the far left of this slide is of the Reverend Teresa Cantrell, who is currently supplying at St. John's Helena. Peggy was her spiritual director, employer at one time, and constant reminder to Teresa to never lose her call from God. Peggy's legacy lives on today at St. John's. So what do we need to remember about the Reverend Dr. Peggy Bosmeyer Campbell? She never lost her belief in Jesus as the foundation of her faith. She believed in the goodness of everyone and that everyone was welcome at the table. She loved to laugh. She loved her family members and all their friends. She loved babies. She loved baptism and to say to the babies, "You are the light of the world. Welcome, welcome." She would ask you today, especially during this season of Lent, how are you making a difference in our world? What is Jesus asking you to do? What small acts of kindness and caring do you share with the world? How are you being a pebble to make a difference in the world? At the end of each church service, whether at camp or in town, Peggy would end with the following blessing. I ask you to share it with me as you desire. Go forth into the world in peace. Be of good courage. Hold fast to that which is good. Render to no one evil for evil. Strengthen the faint-hearted. Support the weak. Help the afflicted. Honor all people. Love and serve the Lord, rejoicing in the power of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Thank you so much, Pam. Did anyone have any questions that if you would write them in the chat room, we can answer them. I'll tell a story, one of my own story. I have this privilege in the spot I am that while I'm waiting to hear a question, get a question. I went to the Commission on Ministry in August of 1990, and I was real nervous about the possibility of being a priest, and I had a young family. I had 3 children, kindergarten, grades 2 and grades 4. And here comes Peggy, who was the chairman of the Commission on Ministry. Now, Peggy, all of you who know her, was a very slight person, very slender, small, but she was pregnant with twins at the moment, 8 months, just about ready to deliver. And she said to me, "Joanne, you have nothing to worry about. God will take care of you. Your parish will take care of you. It's important to be a mother, and don't worry a thing about it." And it really was an important piece that she gave me. Peggy preached my ordination to the priesthood, and I'll always be grateful and thankful for that.
There is a question in the chat room that was she a priest before she was married? And she absolutely was. And in fact, Dennis tells the story that the way they met, he was the youth director, I think it was at St. Mark's in Jonesboro, and took a group to the diocesan youth event. And at the closing service, Peggy preached and celebrated, and Dennis found himself crying, and he didn't quite understand that. And he said, and 2 years later, we were married.
It was the talk of camp. They loved it. Everybody loved it.
Yeah, yeah. Other questions?
How old were her children when she passed?
Larney, Michael and Larney were in their either late teens or just turned 20. Larney was in college, so the twins were in high school. And one of the stories I heard was Peggy's concern that she had an empathy for what her kids would go through because her daddy had died when she was 15. And knowing that it would be difficult for them. And is it true for anyone who's in ministry? It's difficult at the time of the death of someone who is loved by many to also have the family have their own grief. There's public grief and there's private grief. Elizabeth McKeever said Larney was 21. Thanks. So.
Okay, and someone else asked, can you explain further the slide describing her legacy?
Sure. Let me pull it. You want me to pull that up? I'm assuming that's the one with that had the 4. Here we go. Well, there we go.
No, the next one up. There, next one up.
Oh, not this one?
One right before it.
Oh, the one right before it. That's the one about Spiritus and the Institute for Theological Study, which is currently resides at St. Margaret's in Little Rock. If you will Google the Institute for Theological Study at St. Margaret's, it brings up further information about all of those. Wonderful information about what's going on with the Interfaith Center as well. Elizabeth Henry McKeever says, I serve at St. Michael's now and often wonder what Peggy would make of this moment in the life of the church. She was such a trailblazer. Do you have a hunch or a dream about what doors she would want the church to be boldly holding open today? Well, I certainly believe from listening to people, Elizabeth, that your generation, she believes so strongly in youth and young adults being the church in the world that part of her empowering folks is to find out how to best be the church in the world, that we've got to get out of the building. I heard that from several people. The church isn't the building. Be the church in the community.
And there's a question, why didn't you count her years in the diaconate as being ordained ministry? Did you not? When was she ordained a deacon?
She was ordained a deacon in 75, and I thought I talked about that she
Yeah.
began her ordained
I
ministry.
think the slide said 77 to.
Oh, I understand that. Okay. And Babs, thanks for bringing that up. Yeah.
Anybody else? Is there another story, Pam, that you haven't shared that comes to mind that might be something to end on?
What has gotten posted? Oh, the link in the chat room has come up about the Interfaith Center in Little Rock. Thanks. Gosh, there were so many stories. One person shared that you could go into Peggy's office determined to get off of a committee or stop doing something, and you would come out having committed to 3 more years or 5 more years.
I love it.
One person told the story about having their confirmation classes at the local donut shop and how that was so important. And Peggy would say, look around, see who's here. This is God. God is present here. It's not about being in the church. Gail Grant said, I would hope Peggy would want there to be more people of color at the table. Absolutely. And Jane has posted the link to last week's presentation. And she'll talk about that, I bet, at the end. So.
Well, Pam, thank you. This was just wonderful. And I'm so happy that people, even outside of Arkansas, can know all about this wonderful woman who was a blessing to so many of us. And as you have pointed out, her the pebble, the water keeps rippling. So thank you.